One of the most mysterious of an already mysterious class, and perhaps the most mysterious of its rank, Chameleos' ability to completely camouflage itself makes it as hard to study as it does to hunt. But the camouflage ability itself is ripe ground for speculation, as are some aspects of its behaviour and morphology too. So let's explore the deep forest illusion. Chameleos' signature ability is of course its unmatched camouflage, being able to turn itself fully invisible for all intents and purposes. So how would one achieve such a feat? Similar, but not entirely equal, abilities are present in our world, with the best taxa exhibiting such camouflage being cephalopods and especially cuttlefish. Cuttlefish do so with chromatophores, which are essentially granules of pigment in an elastic sac with radial muscle cells. By contracting or dilating the surrounding muscles, they can essentially change the amount of colour visible. Cuttlefish then neurally control these muscles much like any other. Just as we can consciously achieve a wide array of facial expressions and gestures with just a few small muscles, so can cuttlefish with their controlled chromatophores. They also have iridophores as well, which reflect light back at a different wavelength to replicate different colours. This is more like how chameleons do it, who achieve their own colour changes via changing the wavelength of light reflected or absorbed by crystals in their skin. While still an impressive evolutionary feat itself, such colour changes are used much more for thermoregulation and forms of communication than camouflage. Ironically, in this sense, Chameleos' colour changes are much more like a sea creature, but Namael's colour changes are much more like a chameleon. Cuttlefish have iridophores, as it seems they can only produce colours stemming from red, yellow or brown pigments. But in theory, if Chameleos had other pigments available, then it may not need iridophores as well to produce other colours. Presumably like Chameleos, a cuttlefish's camouflage is an innate behaviour, but isn't an automatic one. It's a conscious decision undertaken by the animal. As such, it requires good vision. Blind cuttlefish can't camouflage properly, as cuttlefish camouflage is directly based on their own vision and what they can see, and then replicating that. And again, this is presumably the same in Chameleos. This may be one reason for its rotating and independently focusing eyes. So as Chameleos moves through an environment, it can keep track of both sides of its body, their surroundings, and the different light conditions in the dappled light of the forest environment. This likely requires some brain power to get right, and like cuttlefish, Chameleos is likely capable of visual interpolation. This is essentially the mental process of filling in the gaps with what you already know. Cuttlefish will do this when they see broken patterns and recognise them as whole objects. Again, in the morasses of deep vegetation or dense fog, Chameleos may undergo similarly big brain procedures for its own illusions. Why Chameleos bothers to undo its camouflage for periods is unknown in a Watsonian sense, the doylist one being that the player has to see the monster. But it may be simply that it's tiring. Whole body camouflage by a series of tiny muscles will burn a not inconsiderable amounts of energy. And if Chameleos feels it doesn't need it, there's no reason to waste calories going invisible. Similarly, starving or poor condition cuttlefish also fail to camouflage properly too. So it may be another similarity between them. Other ways of camouflage are bending light around what you want to hide. This is how assorted fictional and non-fictional attempts at cloaking technology often go, such as the not at all supervillain-coded hyper-stealth biotechnology corporation's products. This is another such explanation, although one not really seen in our natural world, though it is mentioned that the material of Chameleos' horn causes the refraction of light. This may be the case for the more mineralized areas of Chameleos like the nose and brow horns, that presumably wouldn't have a chromatophore layer on them, and may also explain why they seem to glow white when uncloaked. There is also apparently the theory that Chameleos' assorted toxins can cause hallucinations, and that he doesn't actually disappear. Though considering many cutscenes with Chameleos are from a third-person perspective, Tripper Snipper Chameleos can likely be disregarded. With the how speculated on, it's now the turn of the why. And if anything, this does seem harder to answer due to the erratic nature with which Chameleos uses its cloaking. It doesn't appear to be hiding itself from its most typical prey, which it readily hunts uncamouflaged. Chameleos is seen to occasionally make undulating patterns, but it's unknown if these serve a purpose relative to foraging, or if it's just essentially stretching its muscles. Cuttlefish will use bizarre undulating patterns to seemingly mesmerize invertebrate prey with poorer eyesight, like crabs. But the mechanism of why this works is unclear, but it's likely that it has something to do with the wave motion, and how the crab then perceives an approaching object, tricking the crab into thinking it's not actually getting closer. Similar things have apparently been observed in land invertebrates too, so it seems likely that Chameleos could potentially use this for hunting its own terrestrial vertebrates too. Like a lot of the forest insectivores and small prey generalists in the world of Monster Hunter, Chameleos may simply get by from the fact its prey are both numerous and relatively incautious. Hornitors, Vespoids, Bonabra, and of course the juvenile Hermitors and Cenotors aren't in short supply, and have limited senses leading to limited anti-predator defense outside of just short lunges to escape, if they even get the chance to. Chameleos may well also branch out to larger prey like Kelby and Mosswine, and even Melinx and people too. In For You, its opening does seem to be an unsuccessful attempt at eating the hunter. On this aspect too, it's worth noting that in the cutscene Chameleos lunges for the hunter, they then don't use their tongue. And this change in behaviour may be as Chameleos' tongue is simply too small for them to grab items as large as the hunter with it. To look at an actual chameleon's tongue, there's the thinner cord of muscle and then the huge suction pad at the end, which can be used to capture animals 15% of its own body mass. This may not sound like a lot off the top of your head, but consider probably the majority of sedentary adult humans can't curl 15% of their own body mass with one arm, and then the thought of pulling that with your tongue is a lot more impressive. While many lizards capture prey with their tongue, only chameleons have taken it to the extreme of the ballistic and telescopic marvel of their tongues. Chameleos, in comparison, has a far less robust tongue, and a far smaller tongue pad, with little ability to form the suction cup, and so it may just rely on saliva adhesion and interlocking. Even with the weirdness and greater durability of organisms in the Monster Hunter world, it may still not be enough to capture prey past a certain size. That includes the armoured hunter. As such, Chameleos' tongue may be used for things only around the size of a Vespoid. To look at what Chameleos eats in-game, it does seem to have the habit of finding a nest of resting invertebrates, smashing it with its tail, and then picking them off as they flee. This is quite interesting, as it's not clear how Chameleos actually locates the nest beforehand. To the common eye, there doesn't seem to be much of a tip-off, but sound, touch and smell are possible options. Sonic bombs can be used against Chameleos, so despite the lack of overt ears, as is sometimes the case in Monster Hunter, it may actually have much better hearing than initially appears. Woodpeckers, who don't have noticeable cues to start finding their food, select for either dead wood or certain parts of certain trees, and then use percussive foraging on the wood. Chameleos may be similar in a certain regard, and look for certain features in the ground or selected trees that may not be apparent to human observers, but do tip off the dragon to insect nests to feed from. In these senses, Chameleos is more like a woodpecker or anteater than a chameleon, but tongue-wise it may be very similar to a woodpecker indeed. Woodpeckers have long tongues that lack the impressive suction cup of a chameleon, but both anchor it with the hyoid bone as Chameleos presumably does as well, or with an equivalent structure. Woodpeckers have the invisible party trick of the tongue being made of a composite nanostructure to make it very flexible yet very strong, so it can be shoved into wood holes to extract invertebrates. Chameleos' tongue likely has a similar level of reinforcing, albeit on a far greater scale, allowing for partial weaponization of the tongue, such as in whip attacks, but also broadening the foraging niche of Chameleos further still. As outside of small invertebrates and large invertebrates, Chameleos does seem to branch out somewhat with its diet. It does partially sequester some ore in its body with the horns on its nose and brow, and so it may make regular visits to ore veins or caves to feed on this particular resource, like a forest herbivore may do the same for salt. Rise also mentions it eating pollen from petalaces. Whilst in-game this is ostensibly for Chameleos to stat buff itself and steal from the hunter, it's still an interesting tidbit on Chameleos. This would suggest it digests carbohydrates, pollens and nectars are digested as sugars, and may have a more complex gut biome than other elders, which are essentially purely carnivorous like Nurg, or purely durophagous like Kushala and the fire lions. Nectar may seem like an arduous thing for it to eat for something so big, But with enough flowers and a sweet enough reward, animals not specialised to eat pollen and nectar will still consume it, as canids like Ethiopian wolves have been seen to on certain flowers that produce a lot of nectar, also possibly making them pollinators too. Said nectar is likely more of a sweet treat and short-term energy boost than a major part of the diet, and is presumably also the case in Chameleos too. This complex diet means that Chameleos can eat what people eat as well, and food could actually be one thing to draw Chameleos to villages. In For You, in one quest, the Jumbo Chief asks you to get rid of a Chameleos by the village, which didn't actually seem to be eating anyone, but more just making a complete nuisance of itself, with none of the usual panic one would expect for an elder. Chameleos may well be guilty of robbing food stores due to a broader diet, and may often succeed due to its camouflage until caught in the act. The other main and obvious option for the chromatophores is likely its own camouflage, hiding it from predators, though there are only a small handful of monsters who could kill an adult Chameleos, and they're as or more rare than Chameleos itself, and much is unknown about elder vision and senses too. Nergigante is the chief predator of most basic elders, and is an old world species that follows individuals making the elder crossing to the new world, as seen in World Story. But whilst in the old world outside of crossings, presumably it'd still go for a Chameleos as readily as any other elder, and if able to use other senses, it'd only make it less clear what Chameleos' cloaking is for. So perhaps it's fair to assume Nergigante is a sight-based predator, and camouflage is the best defense against it. The camouflage and diet could lead to two suggestions about Chameleos as well. One, that it's the most numerous elder dragon, or two, that it may be the most sedentary old world elder. Unlike other elders needing primarily ore for their diet, the far more generalist Chameleos can take a wide variety of more normal food items in highly productive environments. In doing so, it may escape the competition and ties to volcanic regions that other DOS elders have to some degree. With a lot more and more accessible resources, there doesn't seem to be much reason that Chameleos couldn't be comparatively common when compared to other elders, especially when said camouflage also makes it very hard to properly survey on a population level too. Chameleos could simply have a very sedentary lifestyle, and surrounds itself with easy prey in dense areas due to the fact it doesn't really like moving a lot or expending energy, especially if the camouflage may already take up a lot of its calories anyway. In a similar vein to Espinas, this may be why it has the camouflage. It's better to avoid an expensive fight in general. So much as Espinas makes itself inedible with its armoured thorns, Chameleos avoids conflict by being at least partly invisible for much of the year. Chameleos may well be beefing with someone though, and something to indicate this is his teeth. Much of Chameleos' back teeth, where he presumably does most of his chewing, are relatively uniform heterodont teeth not unlike those of many lizards. Simple and triangular to crush up small prey with little specialisation needed. But in the front he has large canine or cuspid-like teeth. These likely aren't for dealing with prey. Small prey grabbed by the tongue are likely brought straight to the back of the mouth, and large prey grabbed in a lunge are still probably killed by the processing after the grab, rather than any specialised bite requiring the front fangs. Many mammals will still have large canine teeth, even when not from predatory or majority carnivorous families, such as primates and ungulates, and in such families the teeth are often used for combat. This may well be the same for Chameleos, who use their enlarged front canine-like teeth to bite one another in fights. In animals with such teeth, this is the behaviour often seen in the males, and it could be possible this is the case in Chameleos too. It would make sense, and some elders do show sexual dimorphism. On the other hand, a lot more elders don't, or at least we can't tell right now. And the sexually dimorphic elders don't always have different weaponry or teeth to one another. So really it could be either way, with the teeth also potentially being a feature in both sexes, and used by individuals to guard their territories from one another. Another curious weapon of Chameleos is the horn. Unlike the multiple horns of horned chameleons, the single horn of Chameleos has no ability to interlock, and so probably isn't used in contests of strength. This may suggest it's used to attack the body, but then Chameleos doesn't really seem to achieve the speeds, acceleration or momentum one would really associate with such combat either. So the horn could be for display. After all, it does apparently contain traces of ore, and may be a signal of health or habitat quality like Glavenus's tail. in that it takes a certain amount of ore to grow an impressive horn, or good bodily condition to synthesize the mineral from said ore. And of course it may also be classic Elder weirdness. Elder abilities are often associated with their horns, although the reasoning behind this isn't clear. Chameleos fails to camouflage after its horn is broken and its tail is cut, and why this would be the case is similarly unclear, although it may be possible that nerve damage or trauma from the attacks temporarily stresses Chameleos to the point of incoordination or shock, causing it to lose control of its chromatophores. But not all of Chameleos' engagements are predation or power struggles, and in a rare moment for the series it actually seems to engage in play with a Melinx in its rise opening. Whilst its interaction with a hunter in 4U does seem to be failed predation, there does seem to be some elements of play as well, even if neither of these are very fun for the hunter or the Melinx. And as is the case with carnivores, sometimes play and predation aren't mutually exclusive. To look at the official requirements for play behaviour, for the Rise cutscene especially, it does seem to fit all the requirements for the first 3 points, and presumably the 5th as well, although the 4th is impossible to say at this point. But it does seem possible Chameleos may be a playful elder. There are a lot of reasons suggested for play: the strengthening of various behaviours or muscles, social interactions with peers, and some even suggest the actions of play have benefits for the central nervous system, almost like a natural workout. But play is hardly unusual in animals, with even species considered as cold and unemotional like bees and crocodilians engaging in such. Rather, it may be that its more play is rarely seen in Monster Hunter, and especially higher level monsters, likely due to their fair hostility to the player, rather than Chameleos being unusual. Although Chameleos is unusual in a lot of regards still, the bizarre rocking motion seen in Chameleos' movement is hard to explain, as it's also pretty unknown as to why actual chameleons do it too. But it does seem to have something to do with being an arboreal ambush predator, as it's both seen in other taxa of this description, but it isn't seen in much more terrestrial chameleon species. Chameleos is associated with forests and dense humid areas, and with natural structures like the giant trees and ruins seen across the world of Monster Hunter, it's not impossible that despite its size it lives as a semi-arboreal animal where it can. We see it use an arboreal ambush on the hunter in 4U after all. This specialisation, combined with its unique morphology, make Chameleos one of the more derived of the crop of base elder dragons. While still sharing some similarities with the rest of the group, it seems to have split off to start doing its own thing some time ago, and became a highly unique elder even for the general standards of the family. I might have said somewhere before that Chameleos is my favourite elder dragon, and he has been since I first saw him on blurry, weirdly formatted 2006 YouTube. The Dosh trio in general were both a huge deal full stop and coming to the west, and Chameleos was the one I was most excited for. And yet, fighting him first time was weird. You like anything in 2 ways, because you like it or because it's good, and happily those points can coincide. And despite being my favourite elder, Chameleos maybe isn't at that stage yet. Like I said, in 2nd gen he was weird, the lack of music until he was enraged, Chameleos being his usual old gen self, and barely fighting you until he got enraged, and then still barely fighting you. He was pretty easy, and even if his fight has changed, he still is, to be honest. 4U was a definite improvement, and Rise an improvement on that, but he's still the easiest and slowest elder. I'm not sure if my Rise was just buggy, but it took me so many hunts to get Chameleos to stop spamming poison, and actually use his new physical moves too. I also think Risen Chameleos isn't really an improvement in this regard, and only really adds further poison AoE attacks, that I don't consider an especially good addition to his fight. Chameleos was always a monster that sold itself very strongly on presentation. The unique animations and movement, that unique music in his first intro, the invisibility, the relaxed demeanour. There was nothing else quite like Chameleos in the games, yet this hasn't really upgraded with Chameleos as the series' ability to double down on monster presentation has upgraded massively. With the colour, invisibility and chromatophores, there's a lot you can really lean into there with different attacks, its health and stamina, and entering an enraged state. I know all of this is possible because much of what I want in Chameleos is already present in Namiel. It's tempting, and half right, to say Namael is Chameleos done properly in this regard. And I do love Namael, she's brilliant. I wish Chameleos did more like her. Though I think Rise made an interesting step towards the right direction too, with Chameleos side-grading his item theft to Spirit Bird buff theft. I think having Chameleos steal your consumables, but actually use them on himself, could be a really interesting way forward, as it would let him buff himself but can also be combined with his presentation. Turning green and patterned after healing himself with your Mega Potions, Angry Red Panther Chameleon in a unique high damage enraged state after Demon Drugs, Bronze and Black after taking an armor skin, maybe even have him steal bombs and traps to regurgitate the effect onto you as well. On top of this, with restocking and mobile camps now being a thing, Chameleos stealing what you've just restocked with to make himself stronger means you may want to think about how much you bring versus gathering in the field, in gaps in the combat. Chameleos is never going to be the quickest, most fast-paced fight no matter what they do to him, so having him being a self-buffing bag of tricks that saps your now highly abundant resources, and dazzling you doing it could be a way forward, says I not working for Capcom. Anyways, everything else about Chameleos is generally immaculate. The design is perfect, the combination of several different lizards coming together in a lizard dragon is wonderful. All his weird vocalizations are also very distinctive too. In general, there's just a lot of effort put into his sound design, and when combined with just how he is, gives a really strong sense of personality often not found in the more one-dimensional elders. The gear is also perfect, no notes, and an excellent theme too. I think all the DOS elders are some of the best and most fitting themes in the series, and Chameleos especially so. I use the orchestral version here on the outro as I think it's the best one, but the original bass one is still very good too. Overall, Chameleos is still a good monster. He's just one I don't think has achieved his maximum potential yet. And to you, thanks for watching. And as ever, a huge thanks to my patrons. Bonecrusher Hyena, Toxic Wolf, The Superest Duper, Samburgo, K. Sandom, Octavia of the Fifth Fleet, Nickname 3110, Erengar Steiny, Kieran McCarthy, Flagon's Archives, Hui Hui, Jabin, The Belted Horned Warbler, Nathan Cross, Tim Gojira, Teddy KGB, Waffle, Dapperaptor, Godzilla Prime 2, Original Username, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Zacer, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakumatsu, whose generosity supports the channel. Thanks to Dragonmaster for the excellent digital artwork and anatomy shots of Chameleos made for this video. Although this wasn't a particular video that allowed for much stretching of creative muscles, with Chameleos spending so much time invisible. You can find a link to Dragonmaster's Blue Sky in the description too. Thanks to I Am the Kaiju King for creating the Chameleos skull. For more skeletals, custom artwork and Monster Hunter theories, be sure to follow him on his Tumblr too, linked in the description below. You can find a link to Dragonmaster's Blue Sky in the description. A bit like last time, Chameleos is a monster I've put off for quite some time, not out of dislike, but because it's hard to say things about him due to how mysterious he is. This might be the last Monster Hunter video until Wilds content is covered. Maybe, maybe not. Depends on both a few things in real life and how much time it actually takes to play through Wilds. It'll likely be the last species profile done until Wilds monsters are covered though. I may or may not do some broader topics in the new year. Again, it depends on a lot. Next video will be a non-Monster Hunter one. That'll hopefully be out at the start of the new year. And then I probably won't use January to make new content, but will likely use that time to remake the Primal Season 1 video that got taken down. Hopefully it'll stay up this time. And finally, to all my subscribers who celebrate it, may you have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.